Hi, everyone. Looks like no one showed up, so I'm going to make this quick, um, just so that way, if any of you are having questions, I can hopefully fill in some gaps on some of the things that you were worried about. So I am going to, or at least I'm trying to share my PowerPoint with you, so give me just a second. Okay, all right, so as you all know, today we're going to be talking about ideographs. You can also call them ideographs, but either way works. And what I want to make sure that we identify is we're going to talk about why McGee developed ideograph. We'll obviously talk about the definition of the term, which is something all of you had to answer on your reading comprehension questions. And then finally, we'll talk about the meaning behind the vertical pole and the horizontal pole of ideographs. You should be able to identify how ideographs function after I give you some examples of them, and then you'll be able to do the activity online about that. All right, so that's the plan for today. Typically in a class session, what I have students do is they answer this quick question. So what I want you all to know when you're trying to read this, I know that this reading is one of the harder ones of this text. When McGee utilizes the words symbolism, dramatism, myth, those three words, think about those sort of as meaning the same thing. So think about those three words as meaning dramatism, which is something you read for last week. And then ideology, he uses that word, materialism and Marxism interchangeably. So you don't really have to understand why. I just want you to understand that he does that so that it will make the reading a little bit easier for you to get through. And so I usually explain that during the class session, and then we spend some time answering this question. So on page 37, I think he does it a little bit in the introduction on 36 too. McGee starts talking about the problems he sees within ideology and symbolism. So these two ways of looking at the world are very different, at least at the time when he's writing this essay. And he believes that people who study ideology are too focused on sort of the abstract, the idea of power and everything happening way up here. And dramatists or symbolists are too focused on down here in like the individual level. They're too focused on why one person does the thing that they do. And so that's his critique of each one. But another critique he has of both of them is that at the time that he's writing this, people felt like you had to be either a dramatist or a materialist. So you had to be a fan of dramatism or you had to be a fan of ideology. And you can see this on page, so I can give you an idea of where he talks about this. On page 36, there's one of the stars. He talks about how people see these two ways of thinking as alternatives rather than supplements. And for McGee, he feels like these two things should be working together. So in other words, when we look at why someone does the things they do, which is what dramatism tries to do, we need to also look at the power structure at hand, because that's going to affect the reason why I choose to act in a specific way. And when McGee was writing this wasn't something that people were really thinking about yet. So that's what makes this essay so important. He's bringing together two ways of seeing the world. And as he brings these together, he is creating something called an ideograph. So this term, many of you defined it in different ways. It is just very simply a building block of ideology, right? So an ideograph is a building block of ideology. And you can see that he's using building block. Those are the dramatists. So each one of us as actors in this ideology can use an ideograph to help build the ideology. That's what he's trying to get at here. With these ideographs, they have to be a word or a very short phrase. So he gives you a bunch of different words. I think he probably talks about freedom, justice. I know he talks about rule of law a lot. All of those are examples. And just a little bit I'll use some more current examples to help us better understand, because I think a lot of the examples that he uses here, it's hard for us to get because some of us weren't alive when he wrote this, and some of us, if we were alive, didn't really care about these issues quite yet. So hold on to that thought about examples. I'll get to that in a second. What's really important here is that when a word is an ideograph or a phrase is an ideograph, McGee says it's way less important that you, as an individual, understand what the word means in the dictionary, right? So you could Google the word, you could see the definition, and yeah, sure, that's fun. But for McGee, what's more important is you see how the word functions in society. And that's how we understand the word. Right? So he's getting at some of these words, which are all ideographs, carry much more meaning than just the definition. Okay, so that's really important that you understand that. An ideograph, a building block of society. All right, so a few things about the ways that these function. And this is where I think things get a little bit confusing. So ideographs function both vertically and horizontally, and it's not one or the other. They function with both of these poles at the same time. Right, so when we talk about vertical function, what we're talking about is the historical pull or the historical weight that a word has. So for example, if I were to use the word healthcare, right, that's a good one because it's something that we talk about a lot right now. That word healthcare is pulled by the weight of the way healthcare has existed. That term has existed in our society. And the fact that really the word healthcare isn't something that was super popular to talk about until like 10, 20 years ago. Right? So all of that history and the Affordable Care Act and how that came to be, all of that is tied to the use of the word, or the phrase, healthcare today. Right? The way that we use it today is the horizontal pull. In other words, the way current contexts affect our choice to use the word healthcare. So, for example, a Republican who is trying to distance themselves from Obama, right, or even a Democrat who's trying to distance themselves from him, they probably wouldn't want to use the word healthcare. Right? They might use something else. They might use medical care or something like that in order to make sure that we wouldn't call up all of the historical weight to that term. Right? So again, the vertical is all the history. The horizontal is what is all this other stuff floating out in the world that might affect the way that I choose to use a specific word. Another example of this, a really new ideograph could be Make America Great Again, or even like Obama's Hope or Change. Okay, so let's stick with Make America Great Again because that's one that, it's hard sometimes to see when an ideograph is being formed, but that's one that's still pretty new. So Make America Great Again right now doesn't have a whole lot of historical pull because it only goes back to like 2016, 2015 here in the United States. It does have some references to like Reagan era campaign and also some references to the UK during Madeleine Albright's campaign. But what's important with ideographs is if most people in the United States don't realize that that's the case, then that ideograph doesn't actually carry that weight. So if we haven't allowed for the history to be connected to Make America Great Again, then the history that I know, the like nerdy history, it doesn't really matter. Right? So let's think about Make America Great Again as something that has about 3 years of historical weight on it so far. So today, currently, if a Republican or a Democrat chooses that, who is not Trump especially, chooses to use that, they are automatically connected, not just to Trump right now, right, but they're connected to everything that he's done in the past 3 or so years. Right? So all of the like rumors about like oh, you know, he's not a fan of immigrants, or he's this or that. All of that stuff is what someone would have to consider currently before they decide to use that ideograph, right? So they might still decide it because maybe they sort of say, well, actually it's not that he doesn't like immigrants, it's more that he is trying to protect the people who are already here, right? So there are a bunch of different reasons why they would still choose to use a phrase, but just know that the current force has to do with like all of the stuff that's going on right now that might affect that choice, okay? If someone's running as a Democratic nominee in a couple of years for president, if we see them use hope and change, automatically ties them to Obama, right? And so I would guess that that's not going to happen because they're not ready to relive those particular campaigns. I would guess that they're probably going to create their own ideographs in order to make their own mark. I'm trying to think of maybe one more example that we could use. We could use, so something that's really generic, like we could use the word women, right? And when we use the word women, we can think about the historical pull or the lack of historical pull that word had for a while. So for example, as this country was forming, everything in the Constitution was written about men, right? And so the fact that that part isn't there is really important to understand the historical or vertical pull of the word woman. Right? And if we're thinking about the choice to talk about women right now, all the current context that's tied to that word are things like the pro-choice movement, the Me Too movement, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So what this is trying to get you to think about is how much more complicated these words that get used over and over have become. And they're trying to get you to realize that by making the choice to use one word or another, politicians are being purposeful. And if they're not being purposeful, they should be being purposeful. They should recognize the weight that these words have, right? So typically, after we talk about that, I ask some questions about whether we think the presidency is becoming pastiche, or in other words, the presidency is becoming this thing where we could like patch together a bunch of different words. We wouldn't even have to have complete sentences, and we would already understand what that particular president had done. If you look at anyone's Twitter bio who's running for president or who has run, you can sort of see that already happening now, right? They don't use complete sentences, they just throw things together. But we obviously can't have a dialogue if there's no one here. And this is the activity that we do in class, but you have an activity to do online, so don't worry about that. And usually to conclude, I have us have a little discussion about whether we think photographs are ideographs. This isn't something that McGee was talking about, but it's something that, although with a different word, might come up later on in the semester. So this is more of me trying to get you to, I'm trying to end on a note where you're like thinking more about, okay, what might ideographs look like after McGee wrote this, right? So we're talking about 20, 30 years after he wrote this piece. Might ideographs look a little bit different? I would say probably, but that's something that we'll talk about in the future. Cool. So hopefully the two things you really need to know, you need to know why he developed the ideograph and how it brings those two ways of seeing the world together. So ideology and dramatism. You obviously need to know what an ideograph is. And finally, know how there's both vertical and horizontal pulls at play when you're using an ideograph. Okay. Yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to help walk you through some of the text, because I know it's a little bit difficult, but hopefully this helped a little bit if you had some questions. All right, have a good rest of your week, and don't forget about the paper due next week.